Good morning, everybody. This is Ben Thorpe with Farm Equipment. Welcome to our latest webinar in conjunction with the North American Equipment Dealers Association. And today's presenter is Carl, I forgot to say her last name,
Shimada.
Shimada,
Yeah.
Chief Market Strategist at Corpay. And before he gets started, I just want to make you all aware of two things. If you look at your screen, the control panel at the bottom, there is a small Q&A icon. You can click there and submit questions at any point during the presentation. And then at the end, we will get through all of them when we have our dedicated Q&A time. And we are recording the webinar, and we will have a replay of it available for everybody who registered. And that's all I need to cover. Carl, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. It's pretty funny that people do have difficulty pronouncing my last name because I think my own family has trouble with it. We just recently did a genealogy search and found out, although we thought we were Austrian, we might have actually been Ukrainian way back. So I'm sure we got it completely wrong too. So anyway, with that sort of prelude, thank you very much for the warm introduction and looking forward to today's session. I guess maybe by way of brief introduction before we get going, I'm Chief Market Strategist with Corpay. Corpay is a foreign exchange firm, so we work with a lot of equipment dealers and on both sides of the border in North America. Helping to manage currency risk and to move money across the border. I'm essentially the chief nerd, so my job is to think about what's going on in the global economy, to think about what might happen to exchange rates next, and to help our customers and I guess the media make sense of it all. So basically what we're going to do today is talk about something that is, I guess, bigger picture. It's not so much something that impacts the Canadian dollar, for example, up and down today, but something that impacts the Canadian and US economies over the years ahead. And so I thought the reason that it was very important to talk about this right now is that, there's a lot of sort of pessimism out there in the media right now about where the global economy is going. If you look at consumer sentiment surveys, business sentiment surveys, people are about as depressed as they've ever been. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that, we did just go through this big sort of traumatic event in the global economy. We just had this pandemic. People are struggling to, find their footing after all of that. And they're depressed about, what's going on sort of socially and societally. But what's sort of fascinating about the juncture that we find ourselves at is that this is the sort of typical situation in which we tend to see an acceleration of innovation. Whenever we have a big shock in an economy, we do tend to see innovation happen next. And I think the reason for that is that, people think that innovation is a bit different than it is, right? So the conventional understanding of how innovation happens is that we have, this mad scientist in a lab, and he's, cooking up crazy chemicals and working on his own. And then he eventually sort of, comes out and shows his invention to the world. And that's, like a nice way to kind of think of it. But the reality is that the way innovation actually happens in the real world is more like Ian Morris put it. He said that change is caused by lazy, greedy, frightened people looking for easier, more profitable, and safer ways of doing things. And they rarely know what they're doing. And so really what this is a guy who's looked at, innovation throughout history and has thought about where the big innovation cycles came from. And in each case, if you really look at what happened, people were sort of firstly sort of scared out of doing an existing thing, scared out of like modes of behavior that they had been following for a very long time. And they got, sort of greedy. They thought about, where the opportunities might come next. And so they shook things up and they started, managing things a bit differently. And so, historically, this has happened over and over where we had lots and lots of innovation that had already happened, but it hadn't actually been deployed in the economy until a big shock came along, right? And that's really sort of like the story of history overall, right? It's just how innovation does tend to happen. So let's talk about, what might have occurred during the pandemic that would cause us to see sort of an acceleration in innovation. I think the first thing to point out, of course, is that with this big sort of move to working from home, societies around the world suddenly had a big gain in efficiency in terms of the amount of time that they were spending every day commuting to and from work. If you look at the time savings that citizens around the world sort of achieved after the pandemic, it's dramatic, right? Like the US is one of the smallest recoveries, or the sort of smallest improvements. And still for most Americans, you're talking about at least an hour a day that's been saved. On average, right? And so you look at even Canada, we're a little bit over an hour that people are saving on average every day that previously was spent in traffic, right? And so that's going into work, it's going into leisure, it's going into caregiving, but it's overall sort of shocking us out of a long-standing way of doing things, right? Sorry, I've got an 85-pound lab sitting under my desk, and she's snoring like it's going out of control here. Didn't expect her to choose there to sleep today. But yeah, so when we think about what's going on, this is a new mode of doing things, and it is surprisingly persistent, right? So this is just one way to look at it. But if we look at the Toronto occupancy as a share of pre-COVID occupancy, so the number of people that are coming back to the office and that are working in the office right now, it's roughly about 47% of pre-pandemic levels. So you have suddenly this huge shift where people are no longer working entirely from the office. And I don't expect that we're going to see that shift back anytime soon. People are going to stick with this to some extent. They're not going to, go back to that full-time office environment. They're not going to, go back to doing things the way they were doing. At the same time, we've had a big shift in consumer spending patterns. So people are spending more money on tangible goods relative to what they used to. Less in-person services and more money on things like, home improvement, on clothing and cars and things like that are physical, tangible items that they interact with every day. And again, this does look pretty persistent. It does look like, consumers have suddenly sort of ratcheted their behavior up in that area and cut back on other areas of spending. And what's sort of fascinating with that is that when we look at how e-commerce has evolved, so the amount of goods that are sold over the internet, it has sort of ratcheted back, right? So we did see this big shift during the pandemic. Of course, we saw people spending a lot more as a share of overall spending online, and that then started to revert back. And if you look at this, this chart here, you can see sort of a gradual incline over time, but you see that spike is actually sort of settling back to where we were. So you're seeing like a reversion to the trend, in other words. Online spending is still taking up a bigger and bigger share of overall spending. But the big jump that we did see during the pandemic is clearly fading away, and people are going back to stores. They're going back to see people in person. They're going back to sort of picking up and touching tangible items as they buy them. And so, you are seeing that sort of big shift erode a little bit. At the same time, we have, those big changes that happened prior to the pandemic continuing. So this is a chart showing working age populations going back to 1950 and then rolled forward all the way to 2100. You can see that dotted line there, which shows essentially where we are today. And you can see that in both Canada and the US, we've had a big drop in the number of new people being added to the working age population every year. There's certainly a lot of talk about immigration in Canada, but if you look at the net effect, once you think about people who are retiring relative to people that are being added to the workforce, we're barely sort of keeping our heads above water. Meanwhile, at the same time, countries like China, Western Europe, Japan, even most Asian countries, those countries are all seeing demographic decline. So what had happened prior to the pandemic is that this sort of trend was in play, but during the pandemic, we really sort of accelerated. We started to see, this becoming much more entrenched, right? And I think that this sort of intersected with what we saw, in terms of overall labor force contraction. So, if we look at the U.S. And the share of the workforce that is part of the workforce, I guess, the share of the population that's part of the workforce. If we break it down, and there aren't terribly precise numbers on this, but if we break it down, you're looking at something like 450,000 people who died of COVID, 420,000 who are suffering some form of long-term illness. And then we have, 2.5 million people who essentially exited the workforce, either due to early retirement or some other reason that we can't identify. And so, you take that sort of long-term demographic shift, and then you put on top of that, you layer on top of that a big shift in how many people are retiring early. And so, why is this? I would argue that a big reason is that asset prices went up so much during the pandemic. So like home prices, equities, like stock markets, they all went up very dramatically, and people decided, that they felt relatively comfortable retiring early and leaving the workforce because they, had those savings. And, that has subtracted on top of that existing demographic trend from the number of people who are working at any given time, right? Now, this is, of course, putting major strain on companies, on employers who are looking to keep people employed and to continue meeting demand. And clearly, if you talk to virtually any business owner across the landscape today, you're going to run into someone who is concerned about labor shortages, right? So when you break all that down, you're looking at a labor market that is historically tight. Just one way to kind of benchmark that is to look at the gap between different racial groups in the United States. So, if you look at overall employment gaps between sort of the white population and other parts of the population, those have been narrowed to historic levels, not anything that we'd ever seen before. So, more people are being brought into the workforce, more people are gaining fulfilling employment than ever before. This is, a dramatic shift, and it's coming because the overall labor force is essentially short on workers. And, of course, this is putting pressure on inflation. So if we look at headline consumer prices, we have seen a huge shift in the last few years. A big shift from essentially from the 80s, back in the 80s, we had high inflation. After that, we had what was known as the Great Moderation. We had inflation rates trending down. We had, volatility in the global economy settling down. And then suddenly we got shocked out of that and inflation surged, right? So, we know that inflation is now rolling over, but this is a big historic shock. And so what it's doing is it's forcing up global interest rates. Central banks around the world are pushing interest rates upward and upward. If we look at what has happened in the last couple of days, even, we've had, in the last week and a half, we've had the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, and the European Central Bank all tell us that they plan to maintain interest rates at higher levels for longer. And what this really means is that, so on top of having that shortage of, sort of physical, tangible goods, on top of being more short on people, we're now also more short on capital, on money. The price of borrowing money is now more expensive than it has been in a long time. And it's pretty darn unlikely to go back to where it was prior to the pandemic anytime soon. So, this is putting a big constraint on the global economy at the same time that we're having an increase in geopolitical competition, right? So the US and China, really the West and sort of the autocracies in other areas of the world are going head to head and competing at a pretty comprehensive scale. And so, this chart here depicts the number of sanctions essentially that the U.S. has placed on Chinese companies and foreign companies in recent years. And you can see that this is, accelerating very rapidly. It's just one way to kind of show what's going on. But if you look at it globally, you're looking at trade barriers going up. You're looking at, rhetoric becoming more and more aggressive over time. So really sort of a clash of civilizations kind of problem. And what this means is that the flow of trade is now facing a challenge, becoming more difficult to move goods and ideas and people around the world. So, all those forces that helped to lower inflation going into the pandemic, that helped to sort of enforce the position of large companies and to, keep the economy running on an even keel, they're kind of going into reverse at, almost simultaneously. And so this is really a situation in which we have a shock that happened during the pandemic continuing to today. It's not going away anytime soon. It's going to be something that's going to be with us for a while. And I think, for many individuals and businesses in the economy, they're just sort of, learning to grapple with this now. It's going to take years before, everyone's really figured this out. So now you might take all of that and think, well, this is really, really bad. And you might, look at history and think that this is bad. But, if we look at other historical instances, like, for example, the Black Death, which happened, around 1350 to 1400, where we had, a huge shock to the global economy with a lot of people, wiped out of the labor force almost overnight. We saw an enormous number of sort of positive developments from that over time. So it was a very, very bad event initially, but once people were, more scarce and more valuable, suddenly we saw an increase in the average weekly earnings per employee. So you can see, that earnings chart there showing, that increase over time. You saw an improvement in the rights of workers. You saw an improvement in how much workers were spending as a share of, overall economic activity. And you started to see the breakdown of the feudal system. So the people who were in charge, the people who were in charge, ahead of the Black Death were no longer so much in charge after. And what started to happen was that companies, well, I shouldn't say necessarily companies, but certainly society as a whole, started to deploy a bunch of innovations that existed already, but were just kind of sitting on the sidelines. So you started to see printing, various ways of making clothing, all of those innovations kind of dispersing across the economy at a more rapid pace. And so this, really started to drive innovation forward. And so I would suggest that to some extent, we're seeing an equivalent episode right now, certainly not at the same scale, but, an episode in which those shortages, that sort of, contraction in the availability of people, in the availability of money, and in the availability of goods is helping to drive innovation forward. And so on that note, the problem that we often have today when we talk about innovation is that we often think about about big social media sites and online commerce and advertising and things like that, right? Like that's one type of innovation. And Colonel Robert Bateman put it very well. He said, once every village had an idiot, it took the internet to bring them all together. I think what he was really saying here is that, we look at these innovations that have happened. We look at the impact that they've had on society, and we think that that's the end all be all for how new inventions get made in the modern global economy. We really do kind of think like that tech companies, as they're called, are where innovation happens. But the reality is that most innovation happens outside the tech companies. The tech companies are just a particular type of innovation, right? So, if we look at it very broadly, we still have the big forces in play. The degree of computational ability that we have is continuing to double roughly every 18 months. That's an astonishing rate of progress that is helping to bring a lot of sort of processing, or I guess mental horsepower into the global economy and helping us to resolve very big problems. We have a huge level of interconnection between various parts of the global economy. So this is just a chart to show the amount of internet traffic that's moving between countries or between regions in the world. And you can see that essentially we tripled that in the last 5 years. And so this means that you have innovations that used to happen in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, becoming global. So something that's invented there suddenly today is becoming a globally used invention, right? And vice versa. And so this is a situation that we have never had before. Before now, we had a situation where, a lot of the inventions that were created, if they were invented in sub-Saharan Africa, likely never made it to the rest of the world. And where, the rest of the world, like the big industrialized countries of the West, were essentially just selling goods to everybody else. So we're seeing that kind of flip and everyone collaborating together. So that means that we have more ideas globally, means that, the multiplication of ideas between us is accelerating. And, ideas are fundamentally, they're having sex. So, which, yeah, I guess you didn't tune into the webinar to hear about this stuff today, but when you think about what's going on, you have inventions in all these different fields being combined, right? They get together, they go on to make children. We have, ideas kind of like multiplying over time. This is, just one way to kind of depict this, but this is the number of papers submitted to arXiv. This is sort of a repository for different scientific advancements. And it's just going up and up, right? Going up and up to the right. And so what's going on here is that all sorts of disciplines are combining together, right? You're having ideas from material science being moved over to computer science, and then, being deployed in how a car gets manufactured or how, farm equipment is made. All of that stuff is multiplying on itself and accelerating the pace of innovation, right? Now, of course, we have the traditional idea of innovation, which is, robots. The installation of robots is going up and up. And by the way, I should kind of point out here, especially for this audience, that this is just sort of, if you think about it on a per capita basis, like the number of robots per person in various parts of the global economy, the Americas are doing quite well. This just looks really impressive because, millions of new robots are being installed in Asia. But when you look at it, collectively, virtually everybody on this call, I'm sure, has seen robots being applied on farms and within agricultural operations. And so, you're seeing that innovation kind of diffuse out beyond the factory floors where it used to be. It used to be that you'd have like a robot on a factory floor and it would do only one thing all day long. Today, you have, very multi-purpose robot installations that are being used in lots and lots of different things. Of course, one of the more interesting and fun ones is like drone sensing technology that's being used to, assess moisture levels and things like that. All of those things are, sort of multiplying on each other and increasing the rate of change that you actually see if you're running a farming operation. Business creation rates have also snapped higher remarkably. So, if you asked any economist back in 2020 what was happening, most people would have said that the business that suddenly everyone who had been laid off in 2020 was going out and starting a business, and that it would tail off pretty quickly. That has not been the case in both the U.S. and Canada. We have just as many new businesses being created every month, and that has sort of plateaued. So this is an economy that has suddenly gone from running things as they were for a very long period of time to suddenly deploying lots of new and creative ideas, right? Very, very, very positive development. If you think about productivity in the long run, what you want to see is lots and lots of new businesses being created all the time. Governments are stepping into the fray here as well. So, if you look back through history, the amount of money that the U.S. government, for example, was putting into R&D, it peaked around the time just after Russia launched the Sputnik satellite and just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was when the U.S. decided, we really need to catch up here. We need to have technological dominance. So we need to spend more money on researching things and deploying them in commercial operations and the military. And you can see here that, the next peak was just before the Berlin Wall fell, right before the Soviet Union collapsed. And we went on a downward trend ever since. So what is widely expected at this point is we're going to see another jump back up. So not only is the private sector going to be putting a lot of money into R&D, but also the government will be doing so in most Western countries and certainly countries elsewhere in the world as we sort of enter this period in which we're competing for technological dominance. So, this is a pretty big game changer in terms of how development even gets done in the first place, right? Governments are much more willing to do generalized basic research where, businesses are much more targeted in what they're trying to do. So, what we could be entering is a period in which we have a nice blend or balance between the two. And, in parallel with all that, of course, we have like this big sort of innovation, how shall I put it, space race, I guess, in terms of bioengineering. So this is just one way to depict it. This is the cumulative number of gel and cell and gene therapies that have been launched globally, just spiking up. So you have new technologies being used to get directly down to the cell level, directly down to the genetic level. Those technologies are very, very likely to end up in a form of customized medicine that is, deployed specifically for you to help you live longer and to live a longer, healthier life, right? And I'm not, sort of, how shall I put it, not just sort of saying this off the top of my head. This is like a real thing. You're actually seeing these new technologies being proven to work for very, very exotic and unique issues. And that's very likely to spread across the population and help all of us to live better. Now, you could say that all of that's abstract, but if you look at what happened during the pandemic itself, here's the pace at which, or how shall I put it, the time that it took to resolve a given disease, going back to 1880. And you can see, we still haven't solved malaria and tuberculosis, although we're getting very, very close to vaccines for both. But historically, it took decades, if not a century, to figure out, okay, we have a disease. How do we combat this? How do we develop a vaccine to solve it? And then, COVID-19 came along, and you take all those things that I was talking about earlier, all that computing power, all that network capability, and everything came together sort of essentially at once. And so one thing that, kind of blew my mind, frankly, in early 2020 was there was an interview with the CEO of Moderna. And he said, in this interview, he said, we got the genetic code from the scientists in China once they'd identified this, and they were willing to share it. And 2 days later, we had a working vaccine. And so I couldn't believe this. I went and checked the facts on this later, because I didn't think that he literally meant that, but he did. What he meant was that once they had the code, they ran it through the computers. The computers came up with the solution. And then the rest of the process was testing, development, and getting it out into people's arms globally. So, if you look at the time period that was involved there, it's shockingly short relative to anything that had happened before. So it's not just that, all this innovation is happening. It's happening in a very tangible way. It's actually, changing people's lives. And it's only accelerating from here. Overall adoption rates of new technology are accelerating. And so, this is just one way to measure it, but this is the number of weeks that it took to reach 100 million average users across a bunch of different platforms. And you can see, Netflix back there at 120 weeks. ChatGPT took all of 2 weeks to reach 100 million users. So, technology is moving ahead very, very quickly. And, I think the fundamental shift that's happening here is that we're resolving what Pablo Picasso talked about. He said that computers are useless. They can only give you answers. Most of us understand innovation as being, or we understand computers as knowing how to give us an answer when we ask them a direct question, right? But we're moving into an era in which we can give a computer a task, a bigger problem to solve, and they can come up with creative solutions for solving it. So let's just kind of look at this from a hard data perspective, right? So this is artificial intelligence test scores relative to human performance. And you can see here that, in most areas of human endeavor, computers are already better. So they're better at recognizing handwriting. They're better at recognizing speech. They have, vastly outstripped our own abilities at image recognition. And you've all probably heard about this, that, radiologists, for example, are finding that, that AI platforms can outperform them at determining where, a cancer is, for example, or determining, what type of issue is going on. Reading comprehension has recently sort of surged ahead of where human beings are, and overall language comprehension has moved ahead. So, like that all sounds kind of abstract, but if we think about the fundamental effects, they're very, very dramatic. So recently they did a big sort of study to figure out how human beings would interact with a chat bot. So, a computerized platform that was answering questions online and interacting with physicians, right? So they put a platform out, the physicians were on there, the chat bots were on there, and then they tried to assess the performance of the physicians relative to the chat bot. And what they found is, physicians were pretty good at the quality of their diagnoses. You can see on the left-hand side that most people found the diagnosis to be, acceptable or good, but they were not good at empathy. So the physicians on the platform really were not empathetic. They were slightly empathetic or worse in terms of, how the clients kind of dealt with them, or the patients dealt with them, right? So then, and so most of us would understand this. Like most of us have had this experience, right? But if you look at what the chatbots did, so this is an AI generated or AI driven chatbot. It turns out that the chatbots are, more accurate. They're rated as far more accurate in terms of diagnosing the issue. And they're also more empathetic. They ask more questions. And so this is really insightful from my perspective, because what it means essentially here is that the chatbots are not deploying the same sort of biases that physicians might have, or that human beings might have, right? They're like asking the open-ended questions. They're figuring out, they're looking at things from a probabilistic perspective, and they're figuring out what the ideal solution is. And that is better for most of us than a physician who has seen many, many cases in his career and is giving essentially the same solution that he's deployed many, many times before, right? I personally did something like this recently, and I really did this on a whim. Wasn't thinking about doing this presentation at the time, but when I went to a doctor, I got referred to another doctor, went in and gave the guy my list of symptoms. He asked no questions, sent me for a scan, then called me 2 weeks later and said, well, this is the solution. I'm going to send you a prescription for whatever it was. And so I went home. I was like, okay, that's what it is. And then I decided just randomly to put the list of symptoms into ChatGPT, which is not a medical diagnostic software, and it gave me like 4 different possibilities. I called the physician back and he said, oh yeah, it could be the other 2. And it did turn out it was one of the other 2. There's many cases of this. There was one in I think San Fran, where the guy had a dog who was very ill. Went to the vet diagnosed him and gave him some sort of injection. The dog got worse. The guy went on ChatGPT and asked it, what might be the problem. The chatbot came up with a diagnosis. He went back to the vet and got that additional drug, and it cured the dog. So, fundamentally, there's something different happening here. This is a different mode of thinking. It's certainly not something that necessarily outperforms humans in every possible respect, but it is something that complements how we think. And so, when we take that and we add it to what's going on behind the scenes in terms of the overall commercialization of AI, we have a huge development underway. So, essentially what's going on right now is that, processing power is improving by leaps and bounds, the amount of processing power that goes into each of these AI models. And so this, really sort of depicts it, but you go from 2 years doubling time back in the 90s to 2 months today. Huge amounts of resources going into this. And actually, I should probably say at this interval, if you want a copy of this presentation after the fact, just email me and I will send a copy over. But yeah, so, big resources going into this. And this is accelerating the pace of innovation overall. So this is exam results across a whole bunch of different exams, including the bar exam, the LSAT, the GRE, the SAT, all of the big sort of exams that are performed to get people into university or to qualify them for their professions. Now, so what we're seeing here is GPT 3.5, which was a large language model deployed late last year. And here's where we are today in terms of performance. So, for example, in the bar exam, we went from like 8% performance to 85% within a period of 6 months. Well, actually less than 6 months. So, it's as if you had sort of a toddler that was walking along today, and by tomorrow they could recite the works of Shakespeare. It's crazy, a crazy pace of innovation. And it's only sort of speeding up. And so, what this means to me is that we're going to see a shift in how we do innovation, right? So we talked earlier about the idea that, ideas have sex, right? That as we, assemble one idea or we combine one idea with another idea, that those can spur additional ideas down the road. That's historically how innovation happened, right? But now we're getting to a place where, we feed what our objectives are into an artificial intelligence model, and we get the thing working on what might the solutions be. And so this could mean that, we vastly accelerate the pace of drug development, for example, that, we show the model what we're looking to achieve, and it combines things until it finds a solution, and the whole process happens within seconds. And so, we wind up with innovations happening almost faster than we can actually deal with them, right? And so obviously all of this is feeding into sort of a frenzy, right? Like we have everybody really, really excited about AI. And this concerns me. Carl Icahn said, some people get rich studying artificial intelligence. Me, I make money studying natural stupidity. Which he was really saying, he's saying that there's a cycle to these things, that we can get overly excited and, cause problems. And I suspect that we are in that phase right now, right? So this is the number of mentions of artificial intelligence in earnings calls from, January of 2016 to February this year, just a massive acceleration. And I would guess that, if I were to run these numbers again, that we'd be literally off this chart. Right. Virtually every business is talking about deploying artificial intelligence at this point. And this is creating a big lift up in asset prices. Right. So, if we look at the gains that have been happening in the stock markets, those are overwhelmingly coming from AI related plays. And this is making, markets a little bit vulnerable here. And in fact, I think that to some extent, this is shifting consumer psychology, shifting business psychology, making us all almost artificially optimistic about where things are going, and even like helping, the Canadian dollar, for example, outperform. So this sort of sense of optimism is probably a little bit overdone, right? When, if we look at it historically, what happens with a big new innovation is we see a cycle like this. There's our dotted line for what we expect to happen. We expect productivity to, move into the positive impact sphere right away. We expect to see, businesses and individuals developing things and deploying them really, really quickly. What actually happens is something more like this, where we have a disruption, we have negative productivity gains for a while, and then we eventually figure it out and move forward. And so, probably the best test case for any of this is how electric motors were rolled out way back. The old factories before, electricity was really brought onto a factory floor, were driven by huge steam engines, which then drove crankshafts. So, you'd have a big steam engine and it would be rotating, driving a big crankshaft through a factory. So everything in the factory had to be essentially linked up with that big camshaft or big crankshaft. And so, you had an organization of the factory that was based on the proximity to the crankshaft and to the engine itself. And that was in place for a very long period of time. But then electricity came along, and so factories initially just replaced the giant steam engine with a giant electric engine and ran the same crankshaft. And in doing that, they actually drove productivity down for a bit because you had to implement the thing, you had to figure out new ways of doing things. And then eventually they figured out, wait a second, we could have like little motors all over the factory floor driving different machineries, and we could have like a path that that our goods sort of go through in order to reach final assembly. So Mr. Ford was one of the first to really figure out that process, and that took a while, right? It took like 50 years at least before he was really ramping this up into big scale. And so what we could be experiencing here in the next few months, in the next year or two, is a bit of a dip in terms of what happens in the economy and the level of productivity that we're generating. Hopefully it's relatively shallow. Hopefully we go through a period in which we grapple with this new technology and we learn how to deploy it much more quickly than in prior cycles. And then we begin to accelerate back out of it. But the big point here is that there's probably a period of disappointment that comes before we get really into big gains. Now, once AI and all these other technologies are really deployed, I would expect that we see a bit of a rotation, that the white collar workers who have been on top for most of our lifetimes, that they won't be anymore, that people with other skills, people with social skills, people with the ability to work with their hands and to assemble things on a more technical level, that they might begin to narrow the gap. So inequality within our society might shrink a bit, and at the same time we might see the rewards within our occupational structure begin to shift in a different direction. Now, you might think that this is going to be really, really bad for everybody, but the thing is that if we look at it historically, the fragmentation of the economy is actually typically quite good. So this is just one way to depict this, but this shows you that back in 1950, over 65% of TV owning households were watching the same show at the same time. Which is crazy, right? Like, if you think about your parents, they were sitting there, all watching the same show at the same time, getting the same ideas at the same time. And then over time, that ecosystem just widened out. You all of a sudden had, lots and lots of variety. And that was good. That was good for, society, for the economy. That was good for the diversity of ideas that we all have. And so, it created opportunities for people involved, right? Like if you were, coming of age in the 50s, you might have thought that there's, only one TV station that you could basically go work for. And, 20 years later, there were dozens of them, right? So the point is that, this overall level of growth actually helps us all. It does take us a while to figure it out, but it does generally help. And so, fundamentally, what we're very likely to see is an evolution in the share of the population working in different fields. And so you guys are like probably the best possible people to think about this stuff. But, back in 1940, almost 20% of the American population worked in farms or on farms or in mining operations, right? Mostly on farms. And, like 20, almost 30% were working in factories making stuff, right? In 2018, the number of people working on farms had shrunk so dramatically, it's astonishing. So, the number of people working in the same job that existed in 1940 shrank drastically. The number of people working on factory floors shrank drastically. And it's funny because, like, I think for city slickers, right, you tend to think of those farming jobs and you romanticize them, right? Like, that would be great to work on a farm. But most people know that, or most people who are actually farmers know that you would not want to be working on a farm in 1940. That was not a fun occupation. So, rotating out of that and increasing the diversity of employment in the overall economy was actually good for the economy and for individuals, right? And then, if we look at the share of employment that has been created in jobs that did not exist in 1940, that has surged, right? So, all these occupations were invented after that period of time. And I don't think that, anyone in 1940 could imagine what was going to come next. You wouldn't imagine that there were television technicians or content creators or yoga instructors or any of that stuff back then. And then today, that's just considered normal everyday occupations for people to have. So this is very, very likely to happen again. There's nothing fundamentally different about AI that's really going to break that rule. As long as society is getting wealthier and more productive over time, typically what we're going to find is new jobs being created. And it's always, always, always impossible for us to imagine it. We just never, ever see it coming. You can find the smartest person in the world today. They might be able to figure out a couple of those occupations in advance, but most of it will come along as the economy itself grows. And so, this folds into a very, very long-term story. So if we go back through all the way back to Roman times, right, and think about the share of GDP generated in each century, you get a chart that looks like this, right? So essentially 41.6% of all the GDP generated in the last 2023 years was generated in the 20th century. And this is in inflation adjusted terms. So, this is the amount of GDP that the entire global population was contributing when adjusted for inflation. And you can see that essentially up until the 15th century there, up until that point that I was talking about, where we had that, the Black Death happening and that big cycle of innovation happening thereafter, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, up until that point, people lived and died without seeing changes in their lifetimes. Like they, had the same number of kids because a large number died during childbirth. They did not live very long lives. They did not deploy new innovations. They lived very, very miserably. That began to change dramatically around the 15th, 16th centuries and accelerated into the 20th century so that, we had a much, much larger global population living longer, happier, more productive lives. And contributing new ideas that accelerated growth forward. And so in the last 23 years, or last 22 years, I should say, we have generated roughly 47% of all the GDP generated in the last 2,222 years. So, that global population growing, but also all those new innovations being deployed all the time has accelerated the level of wealth creation that human society is generating. And so, if we were to continue at that pace, we'll be doubling global GDP within like 10-year periods, and even shorter, perhaps in the future. So, the big bet that you want to make against all of that is that global demand is going to continue to rise. Global demand for food, global demand for better food is going to continue to rise. It's not something to bet against because, that cycle of innovation is accelerating over time. Right. And so all that said, this kind of wanted to close out with the idea that Stuart Brand put out a while back. He said, this present moment used to be the unimaginable future. And I think it's really, really key to think about it this way, because, if you put yourself back to, say 2000 or 1990 or any time before that, you will have heard a lot of doom and gloom about what's coming down the pipe, about, all the geopolitical catastrophes that are emerging, about pollution, about the environment, about, new technologies, all of that stuff. And each time that has been proven wrong. And so, and yet at the same time, the people who sort of bought into those ideas were just utterly unable to imagine where we'd be at today. Even, if you were to look at where we were at the beginning of the pandemic, when sort of everyone was worried about this sort of global catastrophe, if you were to imagine then what is happening today, you'd be absolutely shocked. So, the big bet that we want to make in all of this is that the future is a brighter place. It's just a question of, sort of managing your risk and staying alive to see it come. Right. So, and on that note, I will just end by putting up my my email address here, also my Twitter handle. If you do have any, if you wanted to request a copy of the presentation, definitely shoot me an email, or contact the organizers, of course. And also, if and yeah, definitely, shoot me an email if you just want to chat about everything that's happening out there. So with that said, I will thank you all very much, and hopefully we have a few questions there on the back end. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, do you have any? Did anything come in?
Don't have any questions. If anybody wants to throw one in at the last minute, feel free to look down at the Q&A icon. I had two questions for you myself,
Sure.
though, Carl. The first being that there's a lot of great information in here. I was looking at your slides before we started, and there's an incredible amount of charts in here that are all fascinating. I was hoping you could maybe do one sort of succinct thought at the end about maybe what are the top takeaways that dealers should have from the presentation. There's only one point that they should be looking at in particular.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that you definitely do not want to overly buy into all the sort of recession doom and gloom that we're hearing right now. We are quite likely going to see a downturn in the global economy in the next 6 months. And it could be relatively long lasting, but at the same time, this is all creating a lot of big opportunities. So you don't want to like go hide in a cave and ignore all of that, and sort of close yourself off to the opportunities that are being created.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. And the other question I had was, I really like the slide about AI, and I enjoy using ChatGPT myself once in a while. I wondered if you had any interesting examples of AI being used in agriculture, because I've heard a few pockets here and there, but I'm sure I'm not aware of many things that are happening.
Yeah, so they're definitely like, I think the big thing that AI is being used in so far is in like discovering new crops and working on optimization problems. So trying to find ways to cut water use, to increase the use or to decrease the use of pesticides, all of that, just so that farms run more efficiently. To my knowledge, yet we have not seen like a true AI application that is doing like resource planning on farms. I don't think anyone trusts it quite yet to do something like that. But I do think that that's coming. And then beyond that, we're clearly going to see a big tidal wave of AI being used within machinery itself, like in equipment itself, right? To run sensors, to understand what's happening within the engine and all of that. And to essentially make these things more efficient over time, right? And the funny thing is like just how cheap it is to deploy some of that technology. Like historically, if you did want to add this sort of level of improvement, it would have cost you billions of dollars to do it. Today, like you've used ChatGPT, I've used it. People can like deploy these models really, really quickly. And so, I think it's that wave of innovation is going to hit like within the next year. We're not talking about decades. It's like, within the next year, you're going to see farms shifting in terms of how they're run.
Fantastic. We've had two questions come in. One from Nico that says, what are your thoughts on AI regulation? It will make calls that will have real impacts.
Yes, really good question. And quite frankly, I don't have a good answer. So I don't think anyone does. It's so tough. It's so tough to figure out. I will say that, the basic level, the basic constraints are this, right? Like we know that we have dangers coming from the possibility that, someone hooks an AI model up and does something nefarious with it, or that the model itself goes berserk and does something crazy. We know that that's a thing. We've explored that in science fiction quite extensively. We also know that, international adversaries, for example, like China could be locked in sort of geopolitical combat with the US. And we could have both sides deploying these technologies in terrible ways. But and so that sort of I would suggest means that we're going to have a competition here. that cannot be turned off. You can't, apply regulation to this that's going to shut it down fundamentally, because someone in the world is going to play with fire, right? So my hope for all of it is that the good actors deploy these technologies in an effective way, and use the technology to combat other forms of the technology. And this has always been the case, right? Like if we look at every, prior technological revolution, we've had, new robots or new machines being deployed on both sides. And those things worked to keep themselves in balance, right? And I would expect that that's the world we're going into, is one in which we have different ecosystems competing with each other, and doing things, slightly differently, but ultimately keeping sort of global balance, right? All that said, I do think that we have to approach this whole thing differently than our governments approached manufacturing and agricultural automation prior to that, right? We have to put a safety net in place to train workers when they are sort of rendered obsolete by these new technologies. We have to make sure that we harness AI and its teaching capabilities and things like that, to train up those workers and to get them back out there, right? And to make sure that, we're not in a situation where we're disadvantaging a huge pool of human capital because we're deploying this. Very long-winded answer, but yeah, I'm sorry. Like I probably did not answer that terribly well, and quite frankly, like I as you can probably tell, I have like dozens of books on this stuff behind me. I've read a lot about it, but I don't think that I've seen a persuasive solution from anyone that's been put forward yet.
I like the answer, so I think very well done. The other question we got was from an anonymous attendee, which says, asking if you have any thoughts on batteries and shifting in the agricultural market, power/disposal, etc.
I don't specifically to disposal. It is kind of interesting, like the arms race that's underway right now in terms of battery development. And ironically, we're talking about AI and all of this and material science. Without question, to me, we're about to see a big wave of innovation there. But I definitely am not an expert in battery development or implementation in agriculture. It's just something that humble FX analysts don't know a lot about.
No, fair enough. Okay, well, I think that will do it. So on behalf of NAIDA and Carl and Corpay and Farm Equipment, I want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. There will be, again, a replay available later on the Farm Equipment website. You can watch your Farm Equipment daily email updates for more information on that. Please reach out if you have any thoughts on today's webinar, any topics you want us to explore at any point in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.